Someone sent in some good questions, so I thought for a little change of pace, I'd start with that. On several occasions, you've said, trust life. Please expand on what you mean by that. So life is happening, right? Life is has sort of a life of its own. One set of condition leads to a certain outcome that produces more experience, more conditions that leads to more unfolding in the next moment, on and on and on, without apparent end. So we can see that everything that happens, we can trace it back to a set of infinite conditions, apparently, but we can see the most obvious ones, like if we put a seed in the ground and the soil is fertile and the ground is moist and we have adequate sunlight and it's the right time of year and the seed is healthy, all of those conditions are present, then the seed will sprout. So when the conditions are present, then a result happens. And in that way, life continues to unfold moment after moment. And so that has a movement, and that movement is can't be sliced and diced. It's the entirety of life unfolding, and with the exception of the human mind. The mind has the ability to separate itself in its imagination, not in reality, but in its imagination from the rest of that world, imagining that somehow we're separate from this process of life. So when the question arises around whether life is trustworthy or not, life is life. Life is the entirety of everything manifest and the potentiality for everything to manifest. And the idea that somehow we could hold ourselves separate from that is, well, it's arrogant for one thing, and it's just simply not reasonable. But that the sense of that is what keeps us separate from life. So we can be in a position of either trusting life or feeling like it's somehow opposed to us, that it's somehow doing things, picking on us in a sense, like making it much harder for us than need be, treating other people better than us. In other words, taking it personally. But we can see that all of that is just a judgment in our own thinking mind, arising to a large degree out of wanting things to be the way I want them to be. Right? This is what I want, and if life is offering up something different than that, then life is somehow opposed to me. There's a beautiful Byron Katie quote, and I've used it before, and I may not get it perfect, but it is to the effect that when we realize that life isn't something done to me, it's something that's done for me, the whole flavor of being alive in this lifetime changes. Then life has a benevolent quality to it, that even when it's difficult, if there's a sense of yes, and this is how life is presenting itself for my benefit, for my an opportunity to learn more and more deeply about myself and how life works and my place in the world, etc. So, whether this is ultimately a truth, I can't say yes or no, but what I can say is that it's what I call a useful construct. If we hold that as being conceptually true, let's say, um, life looks different than if we hold another concept that life is opposed to me. Life doesn't like me. So this is a sense of, life is the immensity of everything. So do we trust that or not? And I suggest when we have that sense of trusting life to, um, be ultimately benevolent. It may not look like that in every moment. It doesn't mean that we get to a free pass around difficult things, but it means that our relationship to those things changes when we have a different perspective about the life that we're all completely immersed in and not actually separate from in any way. So the suggestion is you have a choice, but there's some real benefits to just trusting what is inevitable for one thing. Yeah, Anthony DeMillo once had a good definition of enlightenment. He said the absolute cooperation with the inevitable, which is another way of saying, allowing everything to be as it is. It's going to be the way it is anyway, so we might as well get on board and be in alignment with that. Okay, what I thought we could talk about tonight is letting go of attachment. So to talk about that, we need to talk about what attachment is and why it is something to be let go of. And the idea of attachment is when our identity becomes fused with something else. The something else might be a possession, it might be a life partner, it might be a pet, it might be a house, it might be a profession, it might be an idea, a personality. There's lots of things that we can become attached to. So there's a fine difference between being attached to something and simply enjoying something. Right? So let's just, let's say first that when we're attached to something other than what we truly are, it ultimately leads to suffering. And the reason for that is that any object, whatever it is, that lies outside of what we truly are, is impermanent, right? It comes and goes. And, deep down we know that. And so anything that where our identity has become fused with that, there can be anxiousness over a sense of loss because we know that it's vulnerable. Anything in the world of form can come, can go, can be taken away, can change. And therefore there's this grasping onto, right? And it's the form itself isn't the problem. We may have a house that we truly enjoy living in, but the attachment comes in when, if we feel like, oh, if I ever, had to move, or if I ever lost this house, or, I would be devastated. I just wouldn't be me anymore. That sense of, where our identity has become just inseparable from the object. So that's the attachment, and that's the cause for suffering as a result of it. It doesn't mean that we can't enjoy the house. It doesn't mean that we can't appreciate the house. That would be silly, right? So I think one of the things that many people find really meaningful and enjoyable is having a cat or a dog as a pet. And I think one of the reasons for that is that um, um, cats and dogs, when you look into your beloved pet's eyes, um, they're looking back, and they're looking back without judgment. They're looking back with curiosity. They aren't begrudging anything. They aren't holding on to unforgiveness, something that may have happened last week. They're just available without that background filter of thought. So if we wanted a definition of unconditional love, I mean, that's a pretty good definition. Available, loyal, present. Just reflecting back your presence. Beautiful, right? And for a lot of people, that relationship is more meaningful than relationships with other people. Because the essence, just that consciousness, awareness, aliveness in the dog or cat can be much more on the surface because there's not that filter of the thinking mind happening. Whereas with many people, the awareness, consciousness is still present, it's not absent in any way, but it's being filtered through a much denser layer of personality and beliefs and ideas and judgments and memories and expectations and demands and everything else that is present or often present when we're with other people. So even though that aliveness is there, it's often more difficult to see in another human than it is in a cat and a dog or small babies. They're still fresh as well. And I think that's why people really enjoy, looking at small babies, just enthralled by it, right? Babies are looking back and without judgment, without assessing you at all. And so it feels good. It feels really good. So, but what we're really tapping into there is, the form of the dog or the pet or the cat. We can appreciate that, enjoy that, but I suggest that the real deep connection is in that formless presence, something that we can't quite put our fingers on, but we know when it's being reflected back to us from our dog's eyes, or sometimes from another person. And what in this life, I suggest that what is really most valuable, looking back over a course of a lifetime, is not the form, not the accomplishments, not the memories, the experiences, but really the things that are less visible. Things like just loving presence or sense of caring or friendship or enjoyment of beauty or appreciation of joy, in our life, things that can't be measured, can't be quantified, can't be subjected to, um, psychologists' yardsticks, can't be found in the brain, can't really be reduced to a thought. And yet we find that, looking back over a whole lifetime, we find that those are really the most important things, right? So let's say that you had a child which you love, a small child, and when that child is, let's say, sleeping in the other room, you go out to the living room. That love that you felt when you were in the presence of that child, watching a sleeping child, was not entirely absent when you walked out to the kitchen. You may have been thinking about other things, but that love was still, if you just, stopped a moment to remember the child, that love would still be there, even though you couldn't see the child. You were in the kitchen, they were in the bedroom. And then maybe as the child grew, perhaps they went away to school, moved out of town, got a job somewhere else, and you saw that your child, grown child in this case, now less frequently. And yet that love was still present. The physical form was not there, but there was still that deep connection. It wasn't maybe foremost in your mind all the time, but it was also never entirely absent. It was there. Just needed the phone to ring or something to remind you, a picture on the wall, something, and suddenly that connection was there. So the form is beautiful also, to be in the presence of a child or a grown child or a good friend. Being in that presence is beautiful. But there's also something deeper happening, so that when even that physical presence is no longer there, that sense of connection, of gratitude for this person being in your life remains. Right? And then if some grand misfortune happened where the child or the pet was no longer in physical form in this world, it would, we would miss them greatly. There'd be great sadness. We may grieve, but maybe uncontrollably for a while, maybe a long while. We don't know. There's that sense of loss, of never coming in contact with that form again, right? Which feels a lot different than the child just being out of town, available by phone call or, visit next Thanksgiving. So it feels different, but I'd suggest that the actual deepest connection, that love that was experienced as a small child, as a grown child, is also not absent, right? If the love wasn't there, the grief wouldn't happen, right? So the grief is a natural outpouring. We don't know how long it will take. We don't know. It's not really a controllable emotion. It's just an outpouring of sense of loss. And that's not to be denied or diminished in any way. And yet there's also the sense of what is the deepest connection, the place that we were actually inseparable, is that deeper essence of being, a place where there's no separation. where we just enjoy each other's presence, whether that presence is still there in form or not. So even after someone or a, or a pet or a friend leaves this world in form, there's still that love that's undiminished. Physical form, yes, and we can miss that. We can miss that deeply. But there's also something that is untouched by the loss of the form. And that's really our deepest nature. And the reason that I wanted to explain that at some length is that it's really the key to this attachment, because what we're talking about is not the denial of enjoyment. It's not to deprive ourselves of the pleasures and joys of living this life, but it's to recognize that we can do so without fear if we recognize the difference between just sheer enjoyment of the situation versus grasping onto and insisting that the situation remain as it is forever or change the way we want it to. Just that whole grasping, attaching our identity to something beyond what we truly are. So I've been recently reading a book. The person's name is Ajahn Sumedho, and he's an American-born Buddhist monk. He lives in England these days, but he wrote a book called "Don't Take Your Life Personally," and it's an interesting book. And the title is actually quite interesting as well, because that's what we all do, right? We all take our own life very personally. You know, when things happen, we assess whether they're in my best interest or not. And, you know, that sounds a little harsh, but even when what satisfies us is very sophisticated, like I really like myself when I'm of service to other people, you know, it's still in our best interest, right? It may have a social purpose and benefit, but if we're doing it because we'll like ourselves better for having done it, then we've sort of tainted that movement. There's a difference between doing something because there's a need to do it and you have the capacity to do it, and you do it, and there's the enjoyment of doing it, versus doing it because I'll feel better if I consider myself a person who is doing things of social service. Right? Too subtle, perhaps, but quite different in feeling. So the stress that we often feel is really it has to do with the difference between how life unfolds in any moment and how we are holding a position of thinking that it should unfold. Just that difference between the two. And that difference is what causes us stress and is at the basis of trying to sort of coerce life more to our liking, right? So this has to do with attachment to the outcome, which is different, vastly different than allowing life to be as it is, however that unfolds, and in the moment to moment, you know, however life looks in that particular situation, we respond to what's appropriate in our best judgment at that moment, without agenda, without worrying particularly about outcome, you know, just seeing what's needed in that moment. And then the next moment we'll do that as well, right? And it's possible actually to live in that way and be in alignment with life as it unfolds in ways that we um, often can't predict at all. Okay, so I wanted to take a few concrete examples. I'll start with a silly one. Okay, let's say that uh, you buy a Mercedes. So you can buy a Mercedes and buy it because it has, quality engineering, it's comfortable, and it's reliable. Wonderful, and you can enjoy that, and there's no problem, right? You could also buy the same car, but do it for a different reason. Do it thinking, well, if I'm seen driving around town in my Mercedes, then people will look up to me, maybe even envy me, as being someone that's wealthy enough to afford this, quality car. So the difference so that the latter example is obviously an example of being attached to this car, seeing part of our identity is sort of been fused with this machine, right? And this is what actually car salesmen depend on, some people will be enthusiastic enough to sign the documents because it has good engineering, but often it has to do with how you will feel, how you will look, how you will appear, what it'll do to your self-esteem if you're sitting in that particular car. So the difference is that when we buy it for those kinds of reasons, then there's always some built-in anxiety, because what happens if you lost possession of that? Right? If your identity is attached to that form and that form is taken away for whatever reason, maybe you lost your job, maybe the economy tanked and you couldn't make payments, maybe loved one got sick and you had other bills to pay and suddenly you couldn't afford that. But if your identity's in that vehicle and you no longer have it, it can feel like your very being is diminished somehow. People will think less of you. You'll think less of yourself. Your self-image will take a hit, right? Okay, so mundane example, right? So let's take an example of a career. Let's say, for example, you might be a nurse and you enjoy the profession and you feel good being able to help people and be of service. Wonderful, beautiful. But then, what happens at the end of a career when you're no longer performing that role? And, people ask, well, tell me about yourself. And, you used to be able to say, well, I'm a nurse. And now it's not exactly true anymore. You might still have the certificate up on the wall, but in terms of the function that you're performing every day, it's not who you are anymore. So sort of if your identity was wrapped up in that career and you're no longer functioning in that career, what does that leave you with? I mean, is it really satisfying just to relive stories about what you used to be and impress people that way? And I think that's one of the difficulties a lot of people have with retirement. Suddenly they knew who they were, and suddenly from one day to the next, they don't. Their identity was taken away. They no longer have those same relationships happening that were based on their function, and it may have been taken to be who they are. Okay? So that's sort of long-term retirement issue. But also there's the question, what happens like even during the day? you go on break and you go for a walk, or maybe you go shopping after work and buy some things for dinner, go out to a movie, whatever. In the morning you brush your teeth. Are you a nurse at those times? Or are you a shopper and a walker and a moviegoer, and a toothbrusher? It's a function, right? It's not who we are. And at different times, even throughout the day, we're we have different functions. We meet a friend. We have a different relationship than if we're talking to the local banker about a house loan. And it wouldn't be even appropriate to speak with the banker in the same sort of casual slang that we might use with a friend. We have to be proper and act like we plan to pay the loan back. We have a role to play. So we can see this thing of identity. If we can see the difference between a function is different than what I am. Okay. All right. Another example. Let's just take for a random example that let's say you're running a retreat center and you were identified with being a spiritual teacher. And if so, and you were imagining that that's who you were 24 hours a day, it'd be unbearable, right? Unbearable to be around. If you're just having lunch with somebody or working in the garden or, doing carpentry work or driving from here to there, it's just a role. And then there's another role like, to feed the chickens is another role. So if you carry around this identity all the time, it's an attachment to some function that is intermittent at best. And even when you were teaching, if you were holding in the background somehow that this is my identity, this is who I am, that would be, well, it'd be silly, but it would actually get in the way, right? Because it would be confusing, being attached to the identity rather than recognizing what we truly are. And, sometimes this person has this role to play. Sometimes we have another role to play. And if we're not attached to a particular role, moving from one role to the next over the course of a day can be quite seamless. It can be quite enjoyable. Just that flow of whatever is required, whatever life requires of us, we're available for. And if we're capable of doing it, wonderful. If we need to learn something, okay. But to somehow hold ourselves apart from what's being asked of us, like, well, I really don't want to do that. It's not my job. Why should I have to do it, etc. It just gets in the way. So there's a difference of just being available to do what's needed, and move with that. Okay, so one of the things we can do is, in order to get past this sense of attachment, we don't have to try to unlike something that we actually enjoy. So let's say we really enjoy gardening. There's a difference between just gardening for the sheer pleasure of it, enjoying our hands in the dirt, being out in the sunshine, watching things grow. If that's all possible without sort of egocentric identity is that's who I am. That's what I'm really good at. I'm better at it than other people. You know, I mean, especially with gardening, if gardening's not something you want to do if you're trying to protect your ego, because nature has a way of demonstrating its superior strength in how things happen. But anyway, let's so we can do all that without denying that enjoyment of that at all. But if there's an attachment to it, we can look at, rather than trying to get rid of the part that we actually enjoy, we can look at what is the neediness that's causing us to want to be identified as the person who does that. That's our identity. That's who we are. And it's more useful to look at why we're holding on to that attachment than it is to try to figure out ways to get rid of it. Because if the attachment only caused us pain, or there's only a negative aspect to it, it wouldn't survive. But this attachment, this grasping, this movement of our identity into something that we're trying to hang on to, is based on some anticipated payoff. There's something about it that we believe, maybe not consciously, but believe that is to our benefit to hold on to it. So let's take another example. Let's say in childhood we may have experienced deep trauma, right? And I'll just simplify greatly here, but as an adult we may still feel that memory may still be there, and there may be an identity of being the one who was traumatized as a child. And I'm not saying that pain cannot be felt deeply. It might even be felt, at the cellular level where we can't even access it consciously, and yet it still feels operational in terms of fear, anxiety, withdrawal, whatever the sense of it is. And yet there's still an opportunity to look at, what aspect of that yields a perceived positive payoff. And maybe, just to simplify greatly, maybe the sense of, well, at least I get sympathy. These people feel sorry for me. I may not like the identity of being a victim, but at least it's my identity. At least I know it. I'm familiar with it. And if I didn't have that identity, who would I be? So it is useful if we can really look and see what, might only be, 3% of the entire issue, but there might be a positive aspect that's holding it together. If it was all negative, it would tend to drop away. But there can be some positive aspect there that we can really look at. And if we can do that, then it's easier to step into the sense of remembering without judgment. So we can't just forget it. If we were traumatized at an earlier age, we can't just say, well, I'll just forget it. I just won't remember it. Well, that doesn't work. But also, if we remember it and recall it and, feel bitter, anger, hatred about it, that also cements it in place. So we can't just push it away and we can't grab onto it, because both ways are forms of attachment. But what we can do is be willing to step back into our innate awareness and look at what happened and recognize that it's not happening now, except to the degree that we bring it back into current consciousness. If we do it with hatred, blame, shame, judgment, anger, then we're reinforcing it. But if we can do it and allow it to be seen, then it has a chance of releasing its grip. The difficulty is it feels personal because it happened in this body-mind. So that's the benefit of stepping back into that awareness, is to recognize that this body-mind is happening within that awareness. The awareness is larger. And it allows us to look at what happened to this body-mind in a way that isn't available if we're looking at it from this body-mind, right? Feels different. So from the perspective of awareness, there can be just a greater objectivity that allows us to remain present to when that memory arises without getting completely pulled into the story. So the benefit of really seeing through these types of attachments is that it allows us to enjoy the things of life without that underlying anxiousness involved in fearing the loss of whatever it is that we're enjoying. We get to enjoy it as it is without this fear of losing something that feels like our very identity. So the awareness that we can live this life from, we can recognize doesn't require grasping. We don't have to become attached to our awareness or the peace or silence of awareness. It's just an innate quality of it. So we don't have to try to hold on to it. Our job is actually to relax into it. We don't have to hold on to it tight for fear it might go away when we realize that that's all there is. We don't have to constantly be in a state of trying to enhance that spacious awareness because it's already complete as it is. So it's a relaxation into, it frees us up from that tension, that stress of trying to make life turn out the way we want it to. When we can actually relax into allowing life to evolve as it will, because it will, and we can be present for that, enjoy the miracle of it, enjoy the surprise of it, enjoy the creativity of it, enjoy the wonder of it. You don't actually have to hold on to something forever to be able to enjoy it or appreciate it. It's just like if we are looking at a rosebud early morning, dew still on the rosebud. We know that it won't last forever, right? So this idea of impermanence actually isn't a downer. It's really, in a way, makes that appearance of beauty, temporary beauty, not lasting long, even more precious, right? So whether it's a situation, a career, a friendship, beloved pet, family member, life partner, all impermanent, right? Makes those moments that we have together more precious, not less precious. More precious when we recognize and allow and value the temporary nature of that. Recognizing what is truly important is that underlying unity that we can experience in ourselves and see it in others, all others.